We're going to go back to our top story now, the general election that's taking place in Chile this Sunday. The ruling left-wing coalition's communist candidate, Yanet Jara, is leading in the polls against a field of right-wing rivals, but she is looking likely to lose in a second round. For some analysis, we can bring in Javier Sajuria, a professor of comparative politics at Queen Mary University of London. He joins us via video. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Good morning, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Just first, how would you describe what's at stake in this election?
Well, I mean, this is a an election in which basically we have a huge field, as you said, in the right, and they are posed to be the winners in this election in the runoff. Um, we have Jara, which is the candidate from the Communist Party, which represents a broader coalition, which is a continuity from the current government, which is a left-wing government. However, it is a highly unpopular government. And also, Jara has to deal with a huge anti-communist sentiment in the country. So it's unlikely, even though she will most likely get the first position in this election today, she's very unlikely to win in a month's time when the runoff takes place. And the question that we have on the other side is who is going to be the candidate from the right. The one that is most likely to go through it's José Antonio Cast. He is a representative of the far right, the Republican Party in Chile, and it will be his third time running for the election.
Yeah, and what has changed in Chile since then? Because he made it through to the second round in the last election, but he didn't win. So what's changed in the country between now and then?
Well, I mean, you have to remember that back in 2019, Chile went through a huge spate of a huge process of protests during Sebastián Piñera's government. That was a center-right government, and that to some extent led to a constitutional process. And Boric, the current president, was elected throughout that process. Now, the outcome of that first constitutional process was probably one of the most liberal or kind of left-leaning constitutional projects that we ever seen in the country, and it was rejected by more than 60% of the population. After that, during the Boric government, there was another constitutional process. This time, the far right won most of the seats in the constitutional convention or the constitutional council, and the citizens also rejected the proposal that they had. So what has happened is that the country has seen extreme positions taking place in both areas. On the other hand, we've seen an increase in crime and immigration in a rate and a speed that we haven't seen before in the country, and that has been used by the far right as a way to bolster their support. And I think those two elements, these kind of two failed constitutional processes and the rise in immigration and crime, has led to what we're seeing today with a most likely a far right government taking over in a month's time.
Security and immigration are said to be the main issues for voters. Can you talk a bit about what each of the candidates are proposing when it comes to those issues?
Well, the interesting thing is that there's not a lot of differences in the way they're proposing it. Um, what happens in the case of Chile, for observers who might not know the case, is that Chile is one of the safest countries in the region. However, the rate at which crime has increased in the country has been quite fast, and that has affected public opinion, public perceptions of security. Chile has a huge gap between the actual numbers in crime and the perception. Is one of I mean, it's well documented that it's one of the countries where people feel more unsafe, despite the fact that it's one of the safest countries in the world. That is explained obviously as well by politicians taking advantage of this. You can see all the way from Jara to Cast or Kaiser, which is another far right candidate, you see that they are all proposing very similar ideas with regards to immigration, of bringing down immigration. They're kind of proposing very similar things when it comes to crime. Probably the difference is in the emphasis and the style and the way they're presenting it. Both Kast and Kaiser, the far right candidates, talk about the immigrants, even though both of them are sons of immigrants or descendants of immigrants. They talk about immigrants in very harsh terms, in a way resembling what the type of language that the far right uses in Europe. There's another interesting bit. In most of the countries in Latin America, the far right does not use immigration as an issue because it's not an issue. Chile is unique in that way, and it's much more similar to what we see in Europe with regards to immigration, particularly from Muslim countries.
This is described as a very polarized election. Can you explain sort of where in society the fault lines tend to be? Is it a generational split? Is it an urban-rural divide?
We have to remember that this is a constitution, so this is a presidential system, and presidential systems have these kind of particular aspect in which people are asked to are forced to make decisions on sometimes very polarized options. Back in 2021, we had what people might be most people would call like a polarized election, where we had Cast again, a far right candidate, and we have Boric coming from what people would agree that it's more like a far left or traditional left leaning government. Now we're seeing a similar situation. But if you ask me very, if we look at it from the history of this process or what has happened throughout the year, we see, for example, that Cara, despite the fact that she comes from the Communist Party, she won a primary election in which she competed with moderate and social democrats, and therefore she represents a broader coalition from people all the way from the center left to the left. Um, it is polarized because the system is forcing a polarization, but also because I would say the discourse between the elites in Chile is very much polarized. Probably the biggest story here, and the one that many people are not talking about, is the collapse of the mainstream right in the case of Chile. And this is not new in Chile. It's actually something that has happened across Europe and across the Americas. We've seen this in the case of Spain, in the case of France. We're seeing now in the case of the UK. Argentina also had a collapse of the mainstream right, and some people could argue that in the case of the US, the moderate factions of the Republican Party are also collapsing. And what we're seeing here in Chile is exactly the same. So it is polarizing, or it is more extreme, not necessarily because the left has gone to extreme, but because the mainstream right, the moderate right, has completely collapsed.
And as you mentioned, the immigration debate in Chile has, a lot of echoes of that debate in Europe. Why is that? What about Chilean society makes immigration such an issue?
Well, I mean, the big issue in South America with immigration has to do with Venezuelans fleeing their country, right? So it's an estimated over 7 or 8 million Venezuelans has escaped from the Maduro dictatorship, and even though most of them have ended in Colombia, which is a neighboring country, um, in the case of Chile, you have to understand the size of the country. Chile is a country of roughly 19 to 20 million people, and we've seen an increase in immigration from 1.6 to 2% of the population being immigrants at the beginning of 2010, 2012, to all the way to almost 10% at the moment. And actually, if you look at it very closely, you will see that the increase of immigration happened in the span of 7, 8 years. That is a huge increase in a very short period of time. And the shock that this created, has very important consequences in cultural terms, has consequences in crime, because the types of crime that we used to have changed. And I think that has been the main issue. It's not necessarily that the amount of people it's as large as we've seen in other countries, but it's definitely the impact it has on the particular communities. And also, immigrants in general don't tend to distribute themselves or across the country in kind of an even way. They tend to concentrate in certain areas, and obviously those areas have seen most of the impact of it. So I think it's a combination of the speed of change and the relative amount of people that has come through the country to the country in the span of a few years, and obviously with the political use of it. And I think in that way the far right has been quite successful in using the immigration argument as a way to voice support.
All right, we will be closely following, of course, the results of today's election. Javier Sajuria, thank you again so much for your insight today. That was Javier Sajuria, professor of comparative politics at Queen Mary University of London.